say, look around you, your kingdom's wide. Carry the weight of this world with pride. I am humble and I'm confused. There is no mountain I've found here that I can move. And you say, sweet love, your heart is great. So will you follow it closely and let it show you your fate, and keep playing for love, playing for peace, playing for light, come down and set me free, playing to save, playing for change, playing for peace, playing for love, playing for peace, playing for light, come down and set me free, playing to save, playing for change, playing for peace.
Sister, sister, lay your burden down. Keep your heart wide open and hear the sound. It's all around you. Your kingdom's wide to carry the weight of this world with pride.
I am humble and I'm confused. There is no mountain I've found here that I can move. And you say, sweet love, your heart is great. So will you follow it closely and let it show you your fate, and keep playing for love, playing for peace, playing for light, come down and set me free, playing to save,
Oh, we're
playing for change, playing for peace. I'll keep playing for love, playing for peace, playing for life, come down and set me free, playing to save, playing for change, playing for peace. I am playing for peace. We are playing for peace. We are
oh, yeah,
playing for peace. We are playing for peace. We are
oh, we're
playing for change. We are playing.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in this fair country. I am Gary Caldwell, your secretary, and it's my privilege on behalf of our engaged today moderator, as well as your board, to welcome you officially this afternoon. I welcome you to this 60th gathering of folks of similar interest in Christian understanding and discipleship. Some of us do wrestle with the pertinence of dogmas and concepts of yesteryear, and some are not quite so interested, and your program committee recognizes that, and we wrestle with that kind of problem. I'm very excited to see how our day goes today, and I do call our meeting to order. Unfortunately, Dave and Kim both are in the tail end of COVID, a little bit foggy brain, they tell me. So we know that if anything goes wrong today, we have somebody to blame. And that's good for the minutes. We always feel it appropriate to begin our gatherings with with the centering thought. And Dave Ogilvy is going to do that for us now, following which he'll give us a bit of an outline of the day. David?
Thank you, Gary. Thanks for the setup too. Yes, Kim and I both came down with COVID. I don't think we're unique in that regard. My guess is that there are lots of others dealing with this right now too. We both came down with it this week, and we're glad to say that we're recovering, but there is kind of a lingering fogginess in the brain that probably the more disappointing thing for me is that I can't taste and smell right now. So I can't enjoy my food the way I'd like to. I'm just trying to get you all on my screen here again, if I can. And I'm having a little bit of difficulty with it. Sorry about that. And what I will do is spotlight myself. There we are. Thanks, Gary, for the introduction and for the opportunity to lead all of you in some centering thoughts today. As the chair of the program committee, I've had some time to think about this. It's my honor to give some leadership to this group, and I want to thank the rest of our program committee for the leadership that they bring as well. We've been thinking about this day for months and wanting to kind of set it up for you a little bit. And I got thinking about the fact that my mom died last summer. Some of you knew that. And in fact, some of you attended her funeral last fall. And as families are prone to do at a time like that, my siblings and I had the task of clearing out my mom's apartment, sifting through all of her things, and deciding what to give away, what to throw away, what to keep for ourselves. And I think each of us found some treasures along the way. For me, one of the treasures was that I discovered my mom had kept all of my old report cards from elementary and from high school. And I had a chance to pour through all of those and discovered that I wasn't quite the student that I remember myself to be. I was sure my marks were better than they were reported in those report cards. But one of the things that I do recall very well and rediscovered in those elementary school report cards was that several of my teachers made the comment that David would be a much better student if he would spend much less time daydreaming. Seems that I was prone to daydream when I was a kid, and I remember very well that I would love to be just about anywhere other than a school classroom, out exploring the world and my experiences of it. But it seemed that school didn't value or reward me for my imagination. What they wanted me to do was to acquire knowledge, and very specific knowledge, as a matter of fact. My experience in Sunday school was much the same in those years. Church was not so much about exploration as it was about learning a very set core group of doctrines and teachings. And I was rewarded for memory work and for attendance. And I have one of those great Baptist pin collections that many of you will have too, where each year I got a new bar to add to it if I had shown up at Sunday school and if I had memorized some Bible verses along the way. This Tuesday marks an anniversary for me. I realized the other day that it will be the 35th anniversary of my ordination as a Baptist minister within the CBOQ. I was ordained at McPhail Memorial Baptist Church in Ottawa, 1987. And I remember very well the ordination council, where I stood before folks from throughout our association, and I was to declare my faith, my statement of beliefs, and then to defend the statements that I had made. In preparation for that, I actually did a mock council with my congregation a couple of days before, and I discovered that the members of the congregation asked much better questions than my clergy peers who quizzed me at the council later that week. My clergy peers were all, like me, concerned about my doctrinal statement, but the members of the congregation were much more interested in my experiences as a pastor, and it was a different experience, and I really am grateful for that congregational experience, even before the ordination council itself. After 3 years of ordination, I left the church. I have to confess I was a little bit disillusioned. And I couldn't imagine myself spending the next 30 years serving this church that in many ways was frustrating to me. And I decided that I would do an education degree, found myself back at school, student teaching in a grade 3 class, group of wonderful children. And one day, in the midst of my frustrations there as well, I was given the task of teaching a lesson in arithmetic to the grade 3 students. And the lesson was all about magic squares. And I don't know if you remember what a magic square is, but it was a square box divided into 9 compartments. And in each compartment was placed a numeral. And the students were to rearrange those numerals so that if you added them across, up and down, or diagonally, you got the same sum. And just so happened that the day I was teaching this lesson to the class, my professor showed up from university and was there to evaluate me. And the students in the class who I'd already developed quite a rapport with recognized that I was being evaluated too, and they very much wanted me to do well. So I taught them the lesson, turned them loose to work on these magic squares, and very quickly it became obvious that they were not getting it. They were trying their best, wanting me to succeed, but it wasn't happening. So I asked them to put down their pencils and look back up at the board, and I retaught the lesson on the fly from a different perspective, and felt pretty good about that. Turned them loose again with their pencils, and this time probably about half of the students were getting it, and about half of them still were not, and were really struggling with it and feeling the frustration of it. In the midst of that, one of the students, a young boy by the name of Ryan, put up his hand and said, "Mr. Ogilvie, when we grow up, will magic squares matter?" And I remember just standing there speechless for a while. And I'm sure a shaft of light came down from the heavens, because it was a moment of great epiphany for me, that I suddenly realized that in the church, in spite of all my frustrations, at least we were spending time talking about things that probably really mattered, certainly more so than magic squares. And as a result of that, I finished the year, got my degree, and then found my way back into pastoral ministry once again. I'd like to tell you that 30 years later, I spent 30 years feeling satisfied all the time and wonderfully refreshed and renewed by the experience of being part of the church these last 30 years, but that would be a lie. There continued to be lots of frustrations for me. I'd like to tell you that my pastoral leadership was always effective, and it wasn't. But I think the times when I felt that it was most effective were those times when, together as a congregation, we valued creativity over conformity, and insight over knowledge, and exploration over indoctrination, and people over the programs that we were trying to offer. You and I know that the church we love, and I suspect we love it because we're here, that the church we love is dying. And some think that what we really need at this point in time is stricter adherence to a core set of doctrines. What we need is more magic squares where we can nail down everything and get it in its proper order. Conformity imposed from above is the order of the day from our Baptist conventions across the country as they work on identity statements that will create the boundaries in which we must function and live. And that's the way to save the church of today. But I can't help but wonder if Ryan's question to me all those years ago isn't still a fair one. Will it really matter when we get all of this nailed down? Is this what really matters, what we're really supposed to be about? One of the things I do believe matters is how we imagine God. And much of the language and the imagery that we use in church no longer connects very well with or even matters to modern people whose lives are shaped by a scientific understanding of the world and by the technology that we all use. And so I think that we need to think about and to talk about how we think about and talk about God. I think that's one of the very important things we need to do in the church. And it's going to mean that we need to set aside some of the old boundaries, and we need to use some imagination, and we need to be gentle and supportive of one another in that process. One of the things I would love for my church and for our churches, I think, is to become more communities of exploration and discovery that are focused not so much on the curriculum, the dogma, and not about the correct answers, but rather places where we can ask great questions. Not about magic squares and fitting the right ideas into the right boxes, but about boundless imagination in a context of unconditional love. And so today, in a sense, that's kind of what we're about. We've come to open up some space for some exploration and some discovery, space in which to think about and talk about God. And we want you to bring your imagination and your questions. There are no magic squares here. There are no firm and fixed boundaries that we must adhere to. What you need to do today is to come with a sense and a spirit of adventure and openness. And I hope that you will. I'd like to lead you in a short prayer, and it's a prayer that grows out of an idea that I was first introduced to by Marcus Borg, who has been someone that I've appreciated a great deal along the way. It's a Celtic idea that there are thin places. They can be physical sites or they can be moments in time when the veil between us and God seems to grow very thin, and we meet God and have a fuller and richer experience of God as a result. And my prayer is that this time together today might be a thin place, such that our imaginations might be valued and activated, our minds might be opened and expanded, and our souls might be nurtured and refreshed. And so this is my prayer, and I invite you to join me in it, if you will. Oh God, may this time we now share be a thin place where earth and heaven embrace, where the past is interwoven with the future, where we all gather together expectantly. May this be a thin place where hopes are renewed, where faith is restored, where peace is revived, and where love is refreshed. May this be a thin place where fresh words are heard, deep wisdom revealed, and daring promises proclaimed. May this be a thin place where the God who fashioned us, the Christ who remakes us, and the Spirit who inspires us walk among us full of grace and truth. God above us, God behind us, God beside us, God beneath us, God within us. May we be open to see, to hear, and to know your grace revealed as we meet in your presence this day. Amen. It is yes, Gary.
I say thank you, Dave.
Oh, sorry.
You get to keep your job.
I get to keep my job actually for a couple more minutes anyway. Thanks, Gary. It is my delight at this point to just tell you a little bit about our day together. You've seen the outline in the email that I sent out to you the other night. But just so you know, we're going to have our primary plenary presentation shortly. And then there will be an opportunity for questions of our speaker. I'm going to ask you not to wait until that question time to submit your questions, but as they come to your mind along the way, to send them immediately so that we can kind of compile them and be better prepared for that Q&A session. The way that you do that is you use the chat function on the bottom of your screen. You go in there and you look for Kim. Kim is our registrar, and she will also be the one receiving the questions today. And if you have a question you'd like to pose to our speaker, would you send it to Kim in the chat function, and then she will relay it along to us. And like I say, don't wait until the last minute. When something comes to mind along the way, post that immediately, and then we'll have it at the ready to share it later. After the Q&A session, there will be a short break. Then we will reconvene for what I think will be a very rich panel discussion. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the time. And then at the close of our day is a brief time of business for our organization. And we encourage everyone to stay for that. It's not lengthy, gives you an opportunity to find out a little bit more about who we are and what we do if you don't already know those things. And we hope that you'll stick around. It'll probably run about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll close the day formally at that point. We're delighted that you've chosen to spend a Saturday with us in the Gathering of Baptists, and we hope that you find this to be a wonderful and rich experience together. So Gary, do I hand it back to you or right over to Larry? What do you think?
Right over to Larry.
All right, I'm going to call on Larry Ogden, who is also a member of our program committee. And Larry's going to introduce to us our guest speaker today. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Dave. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. David Galston, whom I have had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years. Some years ago, David spoke to several Sunday evening forum events with which I was associated at Burlington Baptist Church. His presentations were always well attended and received with great appreciation. David, along with several colleagues, was the co-founder of the former Snowstar Institute of Religion that was dedicated to promoting religious literacy. I attended several excellent Snowstar conferences which David organized, and the scholars who presented at those conferences were always experts in the field, and they were really quite wonderful to listen to. Currently, David is the executive director of the West Star Institute. He is also the ecumenical chaplain at Brock University, where he is also an adjunct professor of philosophy. As stated on its website, the West Star Institute is a member-supported nonprofit research and education organization that bridges the gap between scholarship about religion and the perception of religion in popular culture. In addition to its research, the Institute publishes the results of its research in non-technical language for a general audience. The Jesus Seminar and its associated publications were the work of the West Star Institute, and David is a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. At the local level, David is the leader of the Quest Learning Center for Religious Literacy, located in Westdale United Church in Hamilton, Ontario. This is a community that examines life, religion, science, and philosophy in an open and engaging environment with an emphasis on learning and open discussion. On the center's website, David publishes a weekly blog, and there is an extensive archive of his blogs on the site, should you care to explore his thinking further. David holds a PhD in the philosophy of religion from McGill University. He is the author of 3 books, and I believe he is currently working on another one. And so, David, welcome to the gathering. We look forward to your presentation on God's human future, overcoming dogmatic addiction.
Thank you, Larry. I need to ask someone, maybe Dave, to allow me the opportunity to share my screen so I can use a PowerPoint, which I'll get to in a few minutes. I've done quite a few presentations on Zoom, and it's very difficult in the sense that it's often you don't get to see the audience and you feel like you're in sort of a isolated chamber. And I have found when I started that the amount of material I had for a classroom setting, which is normally ample, is about half of what I need for a Zoom meeting because you just sort of go straight through it. So let's see if I can do a full hour here. I'll say a few things before I get started though. First of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. Before the Gathering of Baptists, my understanding of the Baptist tradition was quite limited. And this community helped me learn something that I think is kind of always there in the background, is that no matter what denomination or tradition or even religion you're dealing with, when you're with people who are of a progressive mind, who want to dialogue and question and examine and search together, it just doesn't matter where you come from or who you are. It's just really terrific that you can sit down and learn together. So I appreciate it very much. It was a joy to discover the Gathering of Baptists. I never knew it existed, and it was a revelation for me. So keep up the good work. The second thing I might say is that when I talk, I sometimes venture into my politics, and I often feel like I should say, you don't have to vote for what I vote for. You don't have to believe what I believe. It's just me using examples that I'll pull out of thin air. And sometimes they reflect my political position, but I don't mean that. I'm not a politician. And sometimes I use critical race theory, but since I speak in non-technical terms, or I try to, I probably won't say critical race theory per se, but I would imagine in most of your congregations that are not part of the gathering, critical race theory might be something that is suspicious. Certainly it is in the United States, but I think generally it's important to say that the word critical is important because it's about questioning our assumptions. So you could call it re-examining assumptions about race, and it's not just race, but cultural backgrounds and histories. So that's kind of in the background of what I'm saying, but I'll try to stay on a level of not being too technical. And I just also refer to a couple of books that I'll be talking about, not directly, but this one is the God's Human Future book. It's from 2015. And I read it again just because even though I wrote it, I'd forgotten what I said, of course. But it's not a bad book. Some of it, I look at it and I go, it was kind of like it should have been gone through one more time. It's sort of like the last draft before publication. That's how it seems sometimes. But it does make some good points. And one of the things it tries to do is distinguish two types of theology, which I always enjoyed doing, that I called covenant theology and enlightenment theology. And I think they still work. I haven't used those terms actively for a few years, but I do think they work and they're important, so we will use them in this talk. Another book I'll refer to just very quickly is David Hume's An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. And the important thing there is the association of ideas. I want to just talk about that a little bit. We'll touch on it. Here's Anselm's writings. Anselm disagrees with Jesus. I think that's important to say. I just want to show you how, but in this collection of his writings, it's Cur Deus Homo. It's the question, why should God be a human? And then finally, a book I just read recently, which I recommend, is Dominic Crossan's new book, Render Unto Caesar. I was fortunate last week to do an interview with Dominic Crossan about this book, and it's quite good. And he has two theologies in that book, which I'll probably touch on as we go through. He calls them Sabbath theology and sanction theology, which are different from covenant theology and enlightenment theology. But his problem is that our God is this sanction God, and that we have kind of lost touch of the Sabbath God. And for him, the Sabbath God is a God of equality, a God of distributive justice. So with all of that as a kind of a background, and I really do encourage your questions. I won't promise you I have answers to them because I'm a searcher like everybody else. And as you probably all know, the more you learn, the more you realize what you don't know. And often the less you know, the more you think you know. So I've probably got to the point where I know I don't know as much as I used to think I knew when I was younger. Anyway, I'll just begin this sharing of my PowerPoint, and we'll go through this time together. This PowerPoint will go through sort of what we call Enlightenment and covenant theology, but it will point us to the problem that I think we have today in theology, which I call a dogmatic addiction. There is a book I'm working on that I finished a draft. I hope I don't publish it too early. I'm having it reviewed right now, and it is about dogmatic addiction. So some of that book will be in this presentation. And addiction is a very interesting phenomenon, and mostly we relate it to substance abuse. We don't often relate it to religion, but I do think there's ties there. And I'm not a counselor, so I'm trying to be careful about how far I go with the analogy. But some of you out there probably are counselors, and you might be able to fill out some of the things that I will touch on today. But first, let's think about critical thinking. Critical thinking is really important in theology, and it doesn't mean criticizing. And often in religious thought, people will raise questions, and it seems like they're criticizing the Bible, or they're criticizing history, or they're criticizing a group, white people, or something like that. But critical thinking is not about criticizing. It's a real big mistake to be offended when engaging in critical thinking. It's about questioning where we come from, where our ideas are coming from, and if they are accurate. And it's really a gift in life to be proven wrong. It's very hard to accept that because we're all proud, of course, and we don't want to be wrong, and we're not trying to be wrong, but it's a great gift in life to be proven wrong, because it can open you up to alternatives you've never thought of before. And it can also help us to get on a good path. So I think it's very important to make this distinction. It's not about criticizing religion. It's about critically thinking about religion. That's very different. The other thing is, as I just said, it's okay to be wrong. In fact, it's a gift to be wrong. You can't progress in life if you don't try. And if you're not prepared to make mistakes, there's no point in trying. Trying includes making mistakes, and mistakes are these little gifts in life, if you take them the right way, that can help us move along in the right direction. The other thing is that critical thinking makes sure we don't operate on assumptions. And this is very important because we are born in life with a point of view. We can't help but be in the body we have, or the parents that we had, or the place we grew up. But these become built-in assumptions. And critical thinking is uncovering our assumptions. So it's really about ourselves. Most of the criticism of critical thinking, even after I said it's not about criticism per se, but most of it is related to ourselves, to becoming aware of our own assumptions. It's not really about somebody else. And then finally, critical thinking is constructive thinking. Because it's open in its nature, it is about creating relationship with other people. So it's about dialogue. And I think that's another thing that will come up in this talk, the difference between open and closed theology. Open theology is about the process of dialoguing. And it's about changing and changing together and growing. So I think that's very important. Now, one of the big questions that came up with when I first started studying theology and religion and critical thinking, it was a very strange question, but it's also a very historic question. And that is, where do gods come from? I mean, if you start to study religion, one of the very first questions is, why would anybody believe in God or a God? It's not something we see. It's not something we can know about in any natural way. It's created. The ideas of God are created in dialogue and thinking. They're very abstract. Why would anybody think there is a God? That's an important question today. And there's lots of answers to it. So here's the answers from antiquity. In the ancient world, the Greeks thought there was a God because there was organization to the universe. There was logos. There was an apparent pattern that we could experience and depend upon. But so God in Greek theology, in Hesed's theogony, is really an organizer. God is this fateful power of nature, this way of organizing nature and making it move in a certain direction. So a very cosmic God. Now in Greek philosophy, this idea will develop a little bit with Aristotle particularly and become very important to Christianity as it develops after the Council of Nicaea. In Aristotle, God is not the cause of motion. God is the actuality of all potential. So God is like an unmoved mover. That's what Aristotle will say in the metaphysics. But what Aristotle means is that you cannot distinguish between God, activity, and potential. God has to be absolute potential. In other words, anything that can be, or that will be, or that was, is already in God, is what God is. There's no past or present for God. So this is very much the Christian God of the Middle Ages, a perfect being who has no history, not engaged in history, because once God is engaged in history, God's a thing, and God's not a thing. God is beyond thingness. God can't be essence or existence. God is beyond essence and existence. That's very much Aristotle's God. So that's what we end up getting from Greek philosophy, this God who is very distant, quite abstract, and is called actus purus, is pure potential, if you like, or the combination of act and potential without being distinguished. In the ancient Near East, though, which is our biblical God, what we get out of the Bible, God is not like that. God in Genesis, for example, and basically up to Isaiah, is more like a landlord, the landlord of nature. And human beings are created by God to keep the land. So we're the servants of God. We're the stewards. God is like an absentee landlord, not around on the property, but we're here to take care of the property. And that's quite explicit in Leviticus, that you do not own the land. That's what God says in Leviticus. The land is mine, but you are the servants. You are the stewards of the land. And so therefore you have Sabbath, and you have every 50 years you have Jubilee, redistribute the land, because it's not yours. You think you acquired all this land, it's not really yours. Redistribute it fairly. So that's quite interesting. This whole biblical notion of justice comes out of God being the landlord and human beings being the keepers. And then, of course, the Christian refinement in the Middle Ages is to kind of combine both of these. So you get the God who's very abstract and absolute out of Greek thought, but you also get the God kind of being in the land, with the land, in nature. So you get this sense of divine, the sense of divinity, that Latin phrase there. And it's because God is directing things. So God is teleological. God aims things. Telos is that Greek word for aiming. And so God is present in nature. You can read nature. This is like Thomas Aquinas. You can look at nature. You can see its pattern. Remember, logos. You can see its pattern. You know there is a God. It's being directed somewhere. But there's also the ethics of responsibility, which comes into Christianity through Judaism. The ethical monotheism of Judaism is combined with Greek philosophy. And so now you have to explain this. So now we get into the modernity and into enlightenment, and we need to understand these ideas in ways that make sense today. Well, do they make sense? Let's have a look and see. These are the 19th century thinkers: Schleiermacher, Feuerbach, Ludwig Feuerbach, Sigmund Freud, of course, and Emil Durkheim. Schleiermacher, what is he saying? Well, he's going to refine this idea of the ancient Near East and say that God, you see nature and you feel you're dependent on nature. You look up at the stars and you realize your life is limited and you're not an eternal being. You have a dependency, a conditional life. So Paul Tillich, as some of you may know, took that phraseology, conditional, into Christian theology in the 20th century. But Schleiermacher talks about it as a feeling of dependence. So here's his great German word, Abhängigkeitsgefühl. It means the feeling of absolute dependence. So look at Schleiermacher. God's not there as a thing, That's the Greek idea. God's not there as a proof of science. You can't prove God's a thing. God exists, but God is a kind of a romantic feeling, kind of a feeling of dependence, kind of a present available to us. We see God in nature. There's the A&E experience. But we are responsible for this the presencing of God, if you like, in the world. Well, Feuerbach, so Schleiermacher is a theist. Ludwig Feuerbach is an atheist. And he likes religion, but he doesn't like God. And so he kind of says, you know what happens? This is what happens. We look onto nature and we see the power of nature and we see our helplessness and we project onto this idea of God everything that we are not. So we're frail, God is powerful. We're not good at loving, God is all loving. We don't know very much, we're ignorant, but God knows everything. So we kind of create God as this superhuman being. And that's what Feuerbach's critique is of Christianity and of religion generally, but he still likes religion. Why? Because of its ethical monotheism element. He still thinks that sometimes we need religion poetically to be ethical people. So it's kind of interesting. One of the early atheists who still has a kind of a soft spot for what religion can do. Freud, of course, is a bit later. And he just simply states that God comes out of our fear of nature. We need God. We use God as a father figure to comfort our fear, and we just have to get over it. But look at what Durkheim does. Finally, somebody who is not looking at nature at all. He actually says God is not natural. God is a social reality. Social solidarity accounts for God. What's really important about religion is ethics. So when we look at these different kind of gods, Durkheim is the one who raises this question, and this is the key question, I think, which is not how come there is a God, but how does God function? It's natural to want to account for why there is a God or why we think there's a God, but really the social question is how does God function? And that's an important question for us today, because that's what we're seeing all around society is God functions in very strange ways, and sometimes they're very harmful ways, and that's a problem. So in my book from 2015, I tried to do two different ways that God functions. And one way I called covenant theology. That's this history of the ancient Near Eastern concept of God. God's very much social, kind of a landlord who gives the land over to tenants. We're tenants. We have to bind together, take care of the land together. It's not ours. And that's quite good. And it has good expressions and it has bad expressions. But here's the kind of good expression. God, like Durkheim said, can work as an identity marker, a social identity marker. It can bring people together. It can help people be communities together. The tribe of Abraham is an example I use there. God is of that tribe. It's like God marks the identity through Abraham. And it's a family. And they need to care for one another to survive. And so God can be, and this is Gregory Baum now in the 1990s, 1980s, God can be about the social imperative. If you look at Gregory Baum's work, one of his books is called The Social Imperative. He's picking up this idea that the covenant implies a social imperative to care for other people, and that's what society's about. And so therefore, that's what politics is about. And that's where my politics would come up if I pursued that further. But there's bad things about this idea too. So the good I call sometimes the open, because you have to be open to other people. The bad is the closed, because it can get very self-centered or very team-centered, if you like, or tribe-centered. So God can be on a team. So for example, Apollo versus Dionysus in the Octavian and Antony battle at Actium in antiquity is these two gods fighting between these two camps, or these two peoples vying to be the emperor of Rome. Octavian wins, becomes Augustus Caesar, but their God is about violence. This God is about attacking another god and defeating another god. And that often happens in religion. Our God is better than your God. And the other one is that the covenant can take what's called suzerain forms, when one powerful nation conquers another, and then you create a covenant with the conquered nation, and your God is better than their God, and you demand obedience to your God. They have to obey your God, and if they don't, there's trouble. So we get this sort of apocalyptic theology in the tradition. If you don't obey God, you're going to be in trouble. If you don't do what I say, you're going to be in trouble. There's punishment coming. In Enlightenment theology, there are also these sort of good and bad forms, but Enlightenment is not the social element of theology, it's more the personal element. It's how do I improve myself? What's my journey? What do I think is true? Where am I in my life? These kinds of questions are sort of like Enlightenment questions. You're trying to become a true person. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about this in the tradition as well. One of the things, it's not about doing what God says in Enlightenment theology. It's about becoming God yourself. Do you mean God all-powerful? No, I don't mean that. I mean a child of God. That you are a child of God. You can become or realize the divinity within yourself in your way, just as who you are. You have all you need. This is very, very similar to Platonic philosophy, but it's not just Plato. It's a common teaching in religions that you have everything you need. There's not something else that you need. The question is realizing who you are. And so in Enlightenment theology, the problem isn't sin. Sin is a problem in covenant theology because sin is breaking community or causing harm in community. But Enlightenment, it's ignorance is the problem. It's a question of self-realization, becoming who you are. But of course, we know what the bad is. You get egocentric. I know the truth. I'm the greatest. There's never been a better president than me, this kind of thing. And the other element is that because Enlightenment is centered on the Greek idea of logos, the thing that orders the world, sometimes the teaching is you have to stay where you're put. This is your station in life. This is who you are meant to be. And the big truths belong to these bigger identities, royal identities, lords, etc. That's often the case in Enlightenment thinking. So let's look at these two theologies now with Israel, and then let's look at them with Jesus. And then I'll just try to indicate that they don't work quite as well today as they used to, maybe, although we can retrieve things from them, because we don't believe in God like we used to. And that this is part of our problem today. So when it comes to Israel and covenant, there are interesting things, and I call them, should I go or should I stay, from the Clash. I think that's the Clash's song. Israel has a difficulty because it's a small nation. It's between Egypt and then the ancient Near Eastern superpowers like Assyria or Babylon, the Mesopotamian superpowers. It has to negotiate these powers all the time. So that means that Israel has to be in these suzerain treaties or suzerain covenants with other nations. They had to worship other gods. And they sometimes had no choice. Not to worship the other god was to insult that nation. And if that's a powerful nation, they will invade and they will kill your people. That was certainly the case with Assyria and northern Israel. And we have in the Bible these prophets of the north, Amos particularly, Hosea, but they're very troubling for the government, for the royal family and for the government, because they don't want the people to worship Asher, the god of Assyria. But you have to worship Asher. You simply have to do that because it's death if you don't do it. You're looking at your children, at your family. You've got commerce. You're not doing well. You're trading with Syria is an empire. It's got wealth. You're doing okay. you're not going to say suddenly, I don't want anything to do with them. It's very similar to Canada and the United States. I mean, we have a big economy, Canada. We belong to the G20 because we trade with the United States. If we were by ourselves at 30 or 40 million, we would not have anywhere near the economy that we have. Do we worship American gods? Yes, we do. Money, we love money. Big trade, we love trade. How about libertarianism? Yes, that's a good god in Canada too. It all works here because we're successful and it helps us survive. And in fact, some of us do very well by it. I do well by it. So we will worship the American gods. But this is what Israel does. But then along comes the prophets. Don't worship that God. That's the God of commerce. That's the God. You're selling out Israel. You're selling out faithfulness to our God. Our God is the landlord. The land belongs to God. We need the year of Jubilee, redistribute the land, distributive justice. This is the prophetic voice. We're against these big imperial economies. And so now you're the politician. Do you go away from Assyria, or do you stay with them? That's the political question for the kings of Israel. They normally said, we're going to stay with the empires, and they did not listen to the prophets. But of course, it's a fickle business negotiating with an empire, and sometimes they turn on you regardless. So there's lots of so that was the whole should I go, should I stay thing. And Dominic Crossan, in that book I point out, Render Unto Caesar, is the one who says, look, the theology of Israel really is Sabbath theology. The theology of empire is sanctioned theology. And that was always the prophetic question. Do you go to Sabbath theology, practice distributive justice, not recognize the gods of these empires, or do you go to sanctioned theology, reward and punishment thinking? That's the prophets wanted Sabbath. Okay, so I would say the positive thing about covenant theology is because it's community-based, it puts the community in the primary position. So yes, if you're a covenant theologian, yes, you will get vaccinated. Yes, you will wear a mask. You'll do that for the community. You do that because you love people. It's not about libertarianism. It's about solidarity. And then, of course, in Leviticus, you can find, and in Deuteronomy, this insistence that there not be foreigners or strangers in the land. When there's a foreigner in the land, when there's a stranger in the land, you treat that person as your brother or your sister. You care for the foreigner. And that's often not seen in Christianity today, that insistence that we are all brothers and sisters, belong to the family of God. That's sometimes very radical to say, even though you'd think it would be the most obvious thing that Christians would say. Okay, so maybe I'll do this a bit quicker. Israel has this sense of enlightenment, though, becoming God, because the prophets eat the Torah. I mean, it's a strange metaphor in the Bible, but they do. Jeremiah and Ezekiel eat the Torah. Well, it means they become the Torah. And that's the point, that you become the Torah. It's not just that you know it and you recite it, but you live it. You actually live the Torah. That's the call of Israel, to live the Torah. The Torah is inside you. It is your purpose. It's your action. It's your intention. It's your compassion. The Torah is the reality of the world, the real reality, if you like. So you see this great phrase in Isaiah. It's not enough for you to be Jacob. I want you to be a light to the nations, a light to the world. You have to be bigger than just being Israel. You need to be more than just that. And I often think that's a very important lesson in religion. It's not enough just to be a Christian. You've got to be more than that. It's not enough just to be a Muslim or just to be Jewish or just to be Hindu or Buddhist. That's too small. That's too small a thing. You need a bigger spirit than that. Religion breaks apart the denominations of religion. That's its intention. So anyway, how does this play out with Jesus? And it's kind of interesting, really. When it comes to covenant, you do have these things that you can see in Jesus. So Jesus has the phrase, the empire of God. That's a translation of the word basileia in Greek. And it kind of means the modus operandi. So you can say, like Dominic Crossan will say, he translates it as not the empire of God, but as the rule of God, how God wants things to work. It's how God operates. And this is very much not how Rome operates. Rome operates on a different level. So for one of the main distinctions about Jesus and Rome, of course, is nonviolence versus violence. Jesus is love your enemies. Rome is conquer your enemies. Jesus is the compassion of God, and Rome is first conquer, then compassion. So it's quite interesting how you can recognize the empire of God phrase as directly against the empire of Rome. It's a contradiction. So that's why that book, Render Unto Caesar, is basically what has Rome, Caesar, to do with God, or what's the relationship. And that coin is kind of funny. That phrase says, whose image is on this coin? It's Caesar's. And then the Greek, the way I translate it, and the way it certainly can be translated, and probably maybe I could even say should be translated, is give to Caesar what Caesar deserves, and give to God what God deserves. And it's a funny kind of phrase, because it has, the question is, well, what does Caesar deserve, and what does God deserve? And if you're Jewish in the Roman Empire, the first century, you might answer the question, what does Caesar deserve? You might answer that question with revolution. Caesar deserves a revolution, which is what was tried later. And what does God deserve? Well, of course, God deserves justice, that distributive justice. And you can see this in the sayings of Jesus. The rain falls and the sun shines on the just and the unjust alike. So it's distributive, it's not selective. It's a very distributive understanding of God's love, or God's reality, or the empire of God. Love your enemies. Here's where Anselm is completely against Jesus. Anselm, one of the great theologians of the Middle Ages, never read Jesus. I don't know what happened here, but he missed it. Love your enemies is distributive justice. It's not personal. It's not about violence. It's about nonviolence. But for Anselm, who in his Credeus Homo, I thought I might just read it a bit. He says, if sin is passed unpunished, then for God, there'll be no difference between the guilty and the not guilty, and that is unbecoming of God. Well, it's perfectly fine for Jesus to have no distinction between the guilty and the unguilty. So the church has to be careful. It often wants to make God the sanction God, the punishing God, and not the Sabbath God. And then the other thing about Jesus is become the children of God. So it's through compassion that you act. Be compassionate as God is compassionate. That means that you are always in community with your neighbor. And so now, if we take enlightenment in Jesus, you do get these elements too. Being like God, or being a child of God, turning the other cheek. So this is a very interesting phrase. So if you hit me, the readings in Luke, I think this one's from Luke. It's in Matthew 2, but Matthew doesn't do it right. I believe I'm saying that correctly. In Luke, the implication is that you get hit on the left cheek because it's a backhanded slap. So it's a superior to an inferior, and you turn the other cheek and say, hey, hit me like an equal. Give me my dignity. It's a very interesting way of nonviolent resistance to being being in a position of condescension, to being condescended. Equality of dignity. This other kind of, have dignity in yourself, realize God in yourself. Equality of dignity, leaven parable, where leaven makes the 3 measures of flour unclean. And so everything becomes, it's all unclean. So if everything is unclean, or everything is clean, it's the same thing. However you look at it, it's the same thing, right? So everything's unclean, everything's clean. It doesn't matter. The dignity is the same. The clean and unclean division is kind of a creation, a human creation. But the leaven story places God in the unclean, but not just the unclean, but creates everything is unclean. So there's no more division. The celebration of emptiness is very much a part of Jesus. I don't know, we might have to do Q&A on that to come to that a bit more clearly. I'll try to do it very quickly, but there's just this idea that if you grab on and try to hold on to everything, you're going to destroy your life. So letting go is kind of like realizing there's no direct purpose, there's no real reason, there's no absolute certainty. So you kind of celebrate your life out of the act of letting go, out of emptying yourself. And the parable of the prodigal son is really about that, I think, the way that I read it, and maybe we'll have a chance to look at that. Now, along comes the age of enlightenment. And here I've taken these themes of covenant and enlightenment up. But what happens is that the Bible often, I realize enlightenment's actually my next slide, but right here, we're talking about the Bible often converts covenant and enlightenment. In other words, the Bible doesn't like what it says sometimes. The Bible can often be against itself. And even the strongest voice in the Bible is very often anti-biblical. That's a problem also for us. The writers of the Bible usually prefer a powerful God. They usually do not like an equality God. So when the prophets are speaking, they're the minority voice. So Amos is certainly in the minority when he says, God says, I don't like your worship. I don't want your celebrations. I don't like your music. Give me justice. The response to that is no. So here we go. Covenant is converted from social equality to economic success. So for example, I talked about the Sabbath Jubilee. As far as we know, archaeologically and historically, it never happened. It's a command in the Bible, never done. So again, the Bible works against itself. The Bible doesn't like its own contents. Amos is clear that empire and wealth were the higher priorities for the society. So he says, woe to those who lie in beds of ivory. Woe to the elites. But he doesn't change anything. He's just ignored. Deuteronomy is a theology that people do like, and we use it all the time because it is about you obey and you get blessed, and you disobey and you get cursed. You hear that in money evangelism. Do the right thing, obey God, and you'll get a blessing, you'll get rich. And if you're a sinner, you know, you're going to suffer, you're in poverty. The way the Republican Party in the US uses this is disgusting in my mind. But anyway, it's there and it's part of Christianity. Enlightenment is converted from human dignity to human hierarchy. That's a big problem in the Bible too. So remember, I was talking about enlightenment as equality. Remember, leaven, everything's leavened. It's all leaven. Nobody is better than anybody else. All of a sudden you read, oh, wives be subject to your husbands and slaves be subject to your masters. Where did this come from? In Paul, it's no slave or free, no male or female, no Jew or Gentile. But in Ephesians, they're back in place. So enlightenment theology, all of a sudden about dignity, now you've got degrees of dignity. Husbands have more dignity than wives, masters more dignity than slaves. Insiders get the banquet. Parable of Jesus' banquet in Luke is that the wealthy don't want to go. They make up lame excuses. Who gets invited? All the poor. All the people who are left out, they come into the banquet. In Matthew, kind of somewhat similar. People get invited, but there's somebody checking your coat at the door. Someone comes in who's not dressed right, gets thrown out and is burnt, and is in the place where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So in other words, suddenly there's dignity involved in the banquet. If you don't look right, if you don't dress right, maybe you don't have enough money, I don't know, you didn't get your hair cut like you should have, you don't get in. So once again, enlightenment gets converted from human dignity to hierarchy. And that's a problem in Christianity. Now, where do we go from here? I think we're going to say, oh yes, this is what I'm going to say. Very often in the Bible, insight, and this is the word revelation. I'm translating the word revelation as an insight. Insight is what is feared. So this is why the Bible is often against itself. The insight of Jesus is equality. So the birth of Jesus announced to shepherds, angelic announcement, and the shepherds are afraid. That's their first reaction. The women are afraid to speak about the insight they got at the tomb. He's not there. And they go away afraid and don't speak to anybody. So very often the reaction we have to insight is fear. And that's what the church is going through since the time of the Enlightenment. The insights of the Enlightenment, modern science, have made the church afraid. So God stops working. That's the insight of modern science and the Enlightenment. God doesn't work anymore. Well, there's lots of reasons why God doesn't work anymore. It's because, well, now I'm going to probably say something I shouldn't say. It's because there is no God. There's nature, yes, and there's the cosmos, yes, but God isn't about a person who makes it work. And this is the insight of the Enlightenment period. So you never know where insights will lead. And remember, historically, the default reaction of the church in the Bible, we saw, and other religions too, is to oppose enlightenment, to impose insight, to oppose revelation. We don't like it. Jubilee, no thank you. So why did God stop working in this modern period? Well, there's a bunch of reasons for why God stopped working. And one of them is that God, so here I'm going to do three philosophers and Darwin, and who's kind of a philosopher too, I guess. But here you see this development, a slow disappearance of God. So Descartes kind of needed God because he decided to introduce doubt to philosophy. He questioned everything. Does the world exist out there? Does my body exist? How do I know anything? And he decided that as long as he's doubting, he must exist, because the act of doubting proved that he was doubting. So he said, so I think, therefore I am. So that's his main thing. But then he looks at the world. Why do I think there are these different shapes? Everything I see, I can compare to myself, but there's one thing I cannot compare to myself, and that's God. So he uses God to say, I didn't create God. I didn't imagine God. God proves that my reason is reliable. I need God to prove that my reason is reliable. God created me. I didn't create God. So I can trust my reason. Well, the problem is once you start trusting your reason, you don't need God anymore. And that's just what happens right after Descartes. So Spinoza comes in and says, well, why do we need God? Nature explains itself. If we have God anywhere, God is the energy of nature. But that's all we need. And we can examine nature and we can learn. And there are, of course, things we'll never know. Spinoza is very clear about that. We can only know what we can sense and think about. And there's more to it than that. But nature, so far as we can tell, explains itself. So why do we need God? So here's Spinoza trusting reason, like Descartes. He was a Descartes follower, trusting reason like Descartes had suggested. And reason says that nature can explain itself. Then along comes David Hume, and here's this book I was just referring to. I know it's a very complicated book, and it's kind of boring. It can put you to sleep if you're having trouble getting to sleep. This is the book for you. But he makes a really good point, and that is that religion arises out of the association of ideas. So Hume has two things. Number one, where do we get our knowledge from? We get our knowledge from impressions. We get our knowledge from touch and smell and taste and seeing and hearing. And these all make impressions on us in our minds, in our brains, if you like. And so we have this knowledge of the tactile world, but we don't stop there. This knowledge we can abstract, and we can start to associate abstractions one with the other. And we can create things in our minds that do not exist. For example, unicorns. Unicorns don't exist, but we created them out of the senses that we have in relation to the world. So we like horses, for example, and like animals that have horns, we put them together and we got a unicorn. So that's an association of ideas. Now there's other things. What about Hieronymus Bosch and all of that fantastic art that he does, all imaginary? And then of course, what about God? Is not God just an imaginary, something we can create through the association of ideas, but is not really there tactically? And so then after Hume, so Hume really is the great atheist of philosophy. And then, of course, along comes Darwin. Nature evolves over millennia, and nature evolves out of what is already there. So why do we need to introduce God? So God stops working right here in the Enlightenment period, 19th century, basically. What do we do about it? Well, the first thing is, remember, relax. It's not personal. That's one of the things of critical thinking skills. It's not personal. It's not the end of the world. This is an insight. This is an insight of science. We can work with it. So relax. Number two, Jesus told parables. He did not recite facts. He was not telling us what evolution is about or how it works. He wasn't a scientist in any modern sense. He didn't know who David Hume was, but he told parables. And parables are not facts. Parables are stories. Religion, David Hume is right, but let's go with it. Religion relates to the imagination. And under normal circumstances, imagination is not reality, but it doesn't have to be. We can change without any stimulus from reality. We can change because we talk to somebody and because our life, we get a different perspective. We imagine things differently. So what is the purpose of imagination? What's the purpose of religion? It seems like the answer is inspiration and vision. Okay, so religion can have a value because it has the ability to critically inspire us to reevaluate who we are. Okay, I'll just move on from here because we're going to run out of time if I don't start to speed up a little bit. So what happens? What goes wrong when we move from this gift of religion as imagination and recreation, and it becomes, instead of an insight, instead of a revelation, it becomes an addiction? What takes us from insight to addiction? I have three answers to this question, but I don't think these are easy answers or definitive answers, or there are just three. I think that some of this relates to human psychology, and some of it relates to the mystery of human psychology, and there's more answers than what I'm going to relay here, but these are just my thoughts. The one is excitement. And insight is thrilling, and we love it. And that's the joy of learning. We look for insights in life. We want to learn more. We're delighted to meet somebody who can tell us something that we don't know. And it's a thrill, but the thrill can become an obsession. And very often you'll hear people like when I was at Iona College, University of Windsor, we had the Iona College Gambling Institute. We trained addiction counselors there. I didn't do it myself. Of course, there was professors who did the training. But I did sit in sessions now and then just to see what was going on. And one of the interesting things was the thrill that people spoke about who got addicted to gambling, and they couldn't get over the thrill. Even though they would lose everything, there was a thrill about risking. And that happens with insight. It's thrilling, but it can become an obsession. Self-deception is very characteristic, I think, certainly what I learned when I was at Iona College, that the insight into things can be brilliant, but then the insight itself can become a kind of power that makes us think that we can beat the odds, that we're somehow a bit beyond the normal person, and of course you can't beat the odds. And then self-worship. Insight can change us, but sometimes it changes us for the worse. We kind of think ourselves indestructible or great or better than the other person because we know something that somebody else doesn't. And so this brings me to the nature of addiction. And the first one is authority. The substance of addiction takes over our lives. It becomes an authority for us. So addiction becomes a second world in the world we live in. And we sometimes hide it from other people. We have to hide it because it's a secret world we live in. Or sometimes we think it's the good news that you've got to change somebody else to share the same addiction with you because it's a great insight, but we don't realize that it's taken over. It's become the authority. It's prevented us from critical thinking, which is the start of our talk. What is critical thinking? And then there's a great assurance in addiction. And again, I'm going to say that these are things I've thought of myself just based on some reading and experience. They're not the definitive things. But there's an assurance. Oh, I know what I'm doing. You often hear that again when I was in Iona College, people with gambling problems and being talked to in the seminars that were held there. They would often say, I know what I'm doing. I've got control of it. I feel comfortable. It seems right to me. So sometimes addiction gives us the sense that we are in the right place. And then if that happens, the thought of living without it becomes scary because we're leaving a safe space. So somehow the addiction itself becomes safe space. I think you see that a lot in Christianity, dogmatic addiction. It's safe to be a fundamentalist Christian. It's very hard to get out of it. And then the third thing is that addiction always has these assisters or assistants. There's enablers in addiction. So it's easy to get alcohol. If you're alcoholic and you struggle with alcohol, you certainly don't have a problem walking out the door and going and get alcohol. And sometimes you're in a bar and you've been drinking too much and you really should not get behind the wheel. And many servers today are conscious of that and cut people off, but sometimes servers keep serving because it's profitable. And sometimes you're enabled in your local pub to get drunk and maybe to be irresponsible and maybe get behind a wheel. There's always a drug dealer. If you want to find a drug dealers are ready, willing, and able. So again, how do you get off an addiction if it's so easy to be on it? And then in addiction, there's a community you belong to. So sometimes the addiction becomes home and it enables community, even though it's killing you. Dogmatic addiction in particular, let's look at this. Dogmatic addiction is not the same as substance addiction, but there are similar elements, and I think they have the same kinds of things. The authority in dogmatic addiction. For Protestants, the authority is given to the Bible. We become addicts of the Bible, even though we're poor readers of the Bible. Very few of us have been taught to read the Bible critically or have critical skills when reading the Bible, and we become addicted to it in Protestantism, especially, of course, in Protestant fundamentalism. The Bible is given an authority that it just should not have. Roman Catholics often get addicted, I would say, to the tradition of Roman Catholicism. Even when the tradition itself is abusive, you can still defend it. You can still feel it's the right thing. And then orthodoxy and its creeds. And the creeds are built on a three-tiered universe from bygone days, but we still give them authority, the authority of truth. So, this takes the humanity out of the Bible and out of the tradition and out of the creeds. Assurances in dogmatic addiction, they're there as strongly, I think, as in substance abuse. So the Bible is self-referential. Bible's right because it says it's right. So here you go, this creation of your own world. And the same thing can happen with tradition. Tradition's right because tradition says it's right. So you start to create this second world of reality that's disconnected from the real world. And there can be a comfortable sense of self-righteousness. God's on my side. I know I'm saved. Are you saved? This is the assurances of dogmatic addiction. I'm okay. I can handle it. In fact, you should belong to what I'm doing. And then because it's so assuring, it's fearful to leave. It's fearful to change. If you change, you have to admit you're wrong. That's really hard to do, even when you're just breaking. If you're not in addiction in any way, it's still hard on a normal basis to admit we're wrong. So imagine you're addicted to something, it assures you of the world you're in, and then you have to admit it's wrong. It's terrifying. And sometimes it's crushing, and sometimes it's embarrassing. And then you have to enter a new world. So you're leaving a world that used to make sense, and you don't know what sense to make of the world that you're entering in. So can I survive? So I said, can we be good without God addiction? That's a bit of a joke because there's a book called Can We Be Good Without God? And yes, you can be. But if you're in the addiction world, it's really, can I be good? Can I survive without the addiction? And then there's the enablers of dogmatic addiction. And of course, the church is at the top of the list. The church is very often too afraid to ask questions. Remember, we just talked about the Enlightenment. If you ask questions, if you gain an insight, might you be led to atheism or to a very different understanding of God? Or might you think of God in ways you never thought God could be thought of? So the church is often afraid and supports and assists dogmatic addiction. It's afraid that people might leave, or it's afraid that people might have a crisis of faith. And then there's the dynamic hero in the church, the one who wants all the attention, the great preacher who enables worship and wants everybody to be under their thumbs, you know, and to kind of believe that what they say is the word of God and they know how to interpret it. And so it enables an addiction of people to the Bible or to leadership or to authority. And then, of course, the promise of addiction is always promoted, you know, salvation and God's blessing and some victory and you belong to heaven, utopia. Remember, utopia means no place. So it's a very false promise, but nevertheless, if you're dogmatically addicted, these are sentences or promises that assist the addiction, that enable the addiction. So 7 signs of dogmatic addiction, and I'm getting close to the end of my time, but so I'm going to go over it. Remember, I talked about Zoom, and you prepare more than you need because if you don't, you won't have enough. So there are 7 signs that I've come up with, and some of this is my work with Bob Funk. I was able to get his notes. Bob Funk died in 2005, but he was going to write a book called The Incredible Christ, and he didn't get very far with it. And I was given these notes, and I'm turning the book into something on dogmatic addiction. And some of these signs are his, and some of them are mine. I just sort of working with what he had. And so I would say together we came up with 7, but of course there are others, no doubt. But here's a start. Number 1, one sign of dogmatic addiction is a conviction to what should be. So there's no way to see religion as poetry because, of course, poetry is subject to interpretation and addiction is against interpretation. It's about what should be, what ought to be, what must be. So here there you have the sanction theology that Dominic Crossan talked about. The Bible is singular in dogmatic addiction. So it loses its pluralism. It's no longer a library of different kinds of writing, different opinion, different authors, different sources, parables and history. You know, it's not this pluralism anymore. It loses its context, and it loses its right to be wrong. The Bible is a truly human document, then it has a right to be wrong. But in addiction, the Bible has no such right. It must always be right. Jesus is not a human being in addiction, so he's denied his humanity. He's only given one role. He's a savior. Jesus saves, and you got to believe in Jesus, and not just believe in Jesus. You got to believe in Jesus this way. So here we have a loss of Jesus in dogmatic addiction, which is very sad. I think I've given a lot of my life to trying to restore the humanity of Jesus and what he taught, but addiction is certainly a problem that takes that away. And then here's this closed open language. I guess I didn't use so much of it as I thought I would today, but anyway, the Bible is about the final answer. So the Bible's closed. It's not about perpetual questions. And I think people who are, out of addiction and do look at religion as vision and as poetry and as a way to be in the world and as resources for thinking about life are on a journey and love the questions. They embrace the questions. But the addiction element is no, you can't have those questions. It's closed, it's final, it's done. You believe this, done. There's no such thing as inclusive wisdom in addiction. So because it's so hard or closed, it's a division between truth and falsehood, right and wrong, enemies and friends. And again, that's what our politics is slowly becoming, both in Canada and the United States, a division of citizenship into right and wrong, left and right, true and false. Remember, in the Enlightenment, politics changed from being royal politics to democracies. That was a big, huge change. And what was the fundamental element of democracy? The citizen. Every citizen has the same rights. So there can't be a division in democracy. There can be debate, but not fundamentally division between right and wrong. Well, our politics has lost that sense, I think. Authority figures. This relates a little bit to number 3. Authority figures are isolated from normal human experiences. So Jesus is often isolated from humanity. Bible stories, the Bible itself, or Bible figures, or authority figures in the church are isolated from normal human experience. They're given extraordinary ability, extraordinary authority, I guess I should say. Religious creeds, personal beliefs, and confessions are all divine sanctions. So there's a complete loss in dogmatic addiction to see religion as a human creation. And I think that's a tragedy. So religion as a form of addiction is culturally damaging. And we can see this playing out in the extremes in our politics today. And the church needs to step up to this challenge. Can it do it? Is there a cure? Well, let's see if I can do this as quick as possible. Education helps, but education is not a cure. That's a kind of a problem. Education is not a way out of addiction. It is a way to stay out of addiction. So it's not really the beginning, but it's still very, very important because education is about a new worldview, and that's what one has to move to get out of addiction, dogmatic addiction. It seems necessary to hit rock bottom. As far as I can tell, at least most of the time, might be wrong, but it seems to me in my experience, this is almost inevitable. At some point you hit the bottom and you have to start working your way up. And to work your way up is to start confessing what you're going through. I think the churches need to become home for confession. I don't mean, confession booth. I mean, people being able to be honest with themselves and others. Spaces of honesty. So for example, you can read it, anti-vaxxers get COVID. There are some who have gotten COVID and have totally changed and become advocates for getting vaccinated. And this can happen with dogmatic addiction. People can get over it and totally change, but often you need space, a space or a place to do that. And then when you're at the bottom, sometimes you don't see a way out. And that's the tragedy of substance abuse. Sometimes you do not see a way out and you become dangerous to yourself. And this can happen in dogmatic addiction. People can become dangerous to themselves because they feel isolated, they feel betrayed, and they don't know where to turn. The church can be a community that ensures there is care, a welcoming place, a place where you can change and not be embarrassed about it. And finally, the spirituality is a way out, but it has to be mature spirituality. So I think the church has to stop being fantasy spirituality. We have to admit there was a period of time, the Enlightenment, there was Romanticism, was the 19th century and the 20th century. And now we're in the 21st century and we know a lot more stuff. We don't have to think like they did in the first century Roman Empire. We're just not there anymore. So maturity is possible in spirituality. We have to grow up and not believe things that are not really true. So I just put as an example, you can't say, believing the Easter Bunny is a cure to believing in Santa Claus. I mean, you can't just exchange fantasies. So now education becomes very, very important because education is about maturing to an adult spirituality. And the church can be a place where that happens. Let me just do the challenge for the church and then I'll end there. I think, a big question is the church up to the task? And I don't know if it is or not. I know that your group, the Gathering of Baptists, is probably up to the task, but is the church up to the task? I know that, the Quest community maybe is up to the task or trying to be, but can the church be? That's different. Like there's little pockets of communities here and there that feel they are up to the task or are trying to be. But the bigger question is, can the church as an institution be up to the task? And I'm not sure about that. But here are 3 things that I think have to happen. Number 1, churches have to be centers of biblical criticism. There's no place for the average person to learn about biblical criticism except in the church. or the synagogue or the mosque or wherever their community might be. But for us, for Christians, the church is the place where you learn biblical criticism, and we don't teach it. Why? We meaning the church, not necessarily you personally. Why don't we? It's the fear factor comes in. Well, they might leave. We just have to get over this fear. People can't mature if they don't have the tools to mature. Can the church be a center of dogmatic addiction recovery? What if we were to name dogmatic addiction and say this is harmful to society and it's harmful to people, personal lives? And what if the churches were centers of recovery? What would we be? How would we look? And then, of course, humor. You can't really, to my mind, recover anything, including your humanity, if you can't laugh at yourself and if you can't laugh at life. Or with life, even. Maybe I should say that. We have to learn to laugh with life. And can the churches be places that teach us that? Because that is forgiveness. That's grace. That's learning to take the burden off yourself, to lighten up, to find the way, to understand there's creativity, there's possibilities of changing, there's hope, there's things we can do. I mean, humor has a way of opening up the horizon to different possibilities. So I conclude by saying violence is a drug, and the gospel is about nonviolence. The Jesus gospel is about nonviolence. So overcoming dogmatic addiction is really overcoming a kind of violence in life and moving to nonviolence. So very strangely for Christians, overcoming dogmatic addiction is about overcoming belief in Jesus and learning to walk with Jesus. So I'll end it there. And thanks very much. And we'll see if we have questions or not. I'll just stop sharing. And I'll just close my PowerPoint. Okay.
David, thank you. First of all, you've given us an awful lot to chew on and ruminate on, and I think to discuss. This one of my disappointments about Zoom is that it allows us to get together, but it makes it more difficult, I think, at this point to have this kind of engaging conversation with you that we'd like to have. However, I do have a question. I'm just trying to interpret what it means here. David, could you please define mature spirituality by what it is and what it is, as opposed to what it is not? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. It would be kind of ironic because mature spirituality wouldn't necessarily be an answer to that question. It would be fine with the question. But what I think I mean is that, we have to learn that the Bible was written by human beings. That's a mature thing to say spiritually. It doesn't have to be written by God to be spiritual. Secondly, we can learn about biblical criticism without having thrown out everything. Biblical criticism is fine. You can be a scientist. You don't have to believe in God to have spirituality. This is maturity. So it's being able to live with questions, being able to hold your integrity, and being able to admit things that you don't know. And some of us tend to be more theistic than others, and some of us more atheistic. But that's not a barrier to human spirituality. And I think maturity can see that. I met lots of people who are theistic that I know, even though they're very good critical thinkers. I tend to be atheistic or non-theistic, but that's fine. But I still center on spirituality, and I try to mature in that sense. So I don't believe in, Santa Claus in Bible ways.
I think you're right. In that in churches we've been scared to kind of do the hard work that we need to do to educate our congregations about the Bible. We tend, in my experience as a pastor, we still tend to value the people who can quote chapter and verse, and we see that as spirituality. But often those are the very people who can't think critically about the Bible and don't have a much broader understanding of it.
Yeah, I know you're not related to the Southern Baptist Convention or whatever it is in the United States, but they have somebody who said social justice. This was out there electing a new leader. Social justice is against the will of God. And I thought, have you ever read the Bible?
Obviously not huge portions of it.
No, apparently selective reading. But
Yeah.
that was that critical race theory thing, afraid of it. And relating social justice to critical race theory and then just dismissing it as if it.
Let me just remind you, everyone in the meeting here, that you can still submit questions to Kim, and she'll pass them along to me. I have once it's come in. David, as a non-theist, could you still define a God in which the church might believe?
Yes, I wrote one of the chapters in my book is the God who almost is. In fact, I was gonna, just for fun, I'll do this if I can find it quick enough.
Having read your book, that was a line that I actually appreciated very much.
Oh yeah, it's like it's the church exists because God doesn't. If God existed, you wouldn't need a church, but you have the church to talk about God because God's not around to talk for him or herself. So something like that. I can't remember what that is. But anyway, I do think you can talk about God still in a non-theistic way, but what you really mean is the poetry of being human, something like that, or even the poetry of nature. You mean relating to nature, relating to others. You mean an open heart of love. And you could say, God is the energy of all that. That's kind of like Spinoza. So you don't have a theistic God, but you do kind of still have a living God. It's kind of interesting. So I sort of like that. I still can use the God language. I just get careful with it because it does tend to lead us to dogmatic addiction, because you get this dominant authoritarian figure. Even when you don't think God's upstairs, let's say you've outgrown that belief, you still often think God's powerful. And that's still the same kind of language and thought, just in a different way. Yeah. And that's some major tradition. We have to work. I mean, this is hard. We have to work against the Bible itself, retrieving from the Bible those traditions that are against the Bible. I mean, it's so strange, but it's there. There's these theologies, at Crossan called Sabbath theologies of distributive justice in the Bible. And you can obviously see many biblical writers are against that kind of theology, but you can retrieve it from the Bible. So even the Bible, growing up and being spiritually mature, is being able to admit what the Bible is, retrieving what's really possible for us to be thankful for and inspired by, but also admitting its humanity and where it really falls, and where it falls short and where it's very problematic.
Again, in my pastoral experience, this is a huge hurdle that I think many in our churches face, is that we've been taught to think of the Bible as a singular book, and that speaks for God, and so we tend, as you've mentioned earlier, to ignore the contradictions or explain them away in some other way. But somehow, when we finally come to terms with the fact that the Bible is a very human book, the Bible is in fact a library of pieces of literature that cannot and should not be expected to all agree with one another. There's something very liberating and something very refreshing, and I think helpful about that. But that's something that many of our churches haven't got to, I don't think. One more question here that's just come in. Can you further describe what a church that is a dogmatic addiction recovery center, what that kind of church might look like?
Yeah, I'm still kind of exploring that myself. I kind of sort of got that out of Bob Funk, but in a way, but he never put it that way, but in the midst of working with this stuff he was thinking about as addiction, religion as addiction, it did occur to me, like, because he emphasized church as community. So he was very much a covenant-like theologian, that it was really about solidarity, and he was very big on the church teaching biblical criticism. But I kind of riffed on that, and I thought, what if it was like a recovery center for dogmatic addiction? And I thought, because if you're getting out of fundamentalism, like I know several people who have, then you don't know where to go. And it'd be interesting for churches to say, hey, are you recovering from dogmatic addiction? Like, welcome to our place. Like, we'll help you get over the hurdle. But what would you do exactly? Well, I think you end up, being in solidarity, allowing people to tell their story, which is what we often don't do in church. When the community I'm in now is kind of a lecture center, talk back. But when we're a smaller community than we used to be. But when we were a bigger community and we had a church, a building up on the mountain, we would have these nights that instead of a sermon, somebody would come up and I would just interview, like I was, David Letterman or somebody interviewing a guest, and they would talk about the spiritual journey and stuff. And the things that you learn from people, from their story, this is what dogmatic addicted people need. They need to tell their story. And we need to be just creative in opening ways for people to tell their journey in an environment where they trust others. They're not going to be judged. And it's nerve-wracking. I mean, I remember the very first person who did that was quite afraid to say, her story, but she did get through it, and people responded really well, and the community, accepted her, and she felt quite good about it.
This is thank you. This is a little longer one, so bear with me here, but it says, this person writes, I've heard it said that if you're looking for dating advice, don't ask a married person, as they're not actively looking for a partner. Could one say something similar about those who have said they are secure in their faith, secure in knowing everything, that they're not the people you want to hang out with? Is this where we put seekers together to understand better what the journey is about?
I think I get that, and there's boy, I gotta see if I can remember this. I can't remember the name of the author, but this is like from 1910 or so. There was an author who wrote that the church was moving to fundamentalism, and that the experimentalists in the church were leaving. The experimentalists were the people who were trying to deal with this change in knowledge. Science has come up, and we have biblical criticism, and we don't accept the three-tiered universe that they used to define antiquity. We now know expanding universe and all this stuff. So they were experimenting with the future of the church, but they were against the traditionalists in the middle, and then the fundamentalists on the right. And the traditionalists can get along with the fundamentalists, because at least the fundamentalists uphold some of the traditional dogma, whereas the experimentalists can't get along with either one. So they would slowly go into the minority and leave. And what would be left in the church would be fundamentalism and traditionalism. And the experimental side of the church would be out in culture, in secular society. And you could say that's basically what has happened, except what he didn't see is that some of the experimentalists would get together and become the Gathering of Baptists or some other group. They would find each other some way and form a community. And I think that addresses the question. Yeah, we do need, so Bob Punk, was right. We still need community, even when we've totally changed and we just can't relate to that other way of being religious or whatever it is. We don't relate to it. We still do need communities to belong to. And I think we end up finding each other and finding ways to be together. So if I think that addresses the question, yeah, there will still be communities. And it's so tough because it's not just what you believe, right? It's politics as well, unfortunately. Religion gets mixed into politics, and I worry about the future of the earth because I worry about the dominant voice in politics slowly becoming fundamentalism.
David, I wish we had more time too. I'm just aware that our time for this has come to a close for now. But thank you very much for tickling our thinking and starting us. This analogy of dogmatic addiction is one that I need to spend some more time with. But I think it's a very rich metaphor, and one that does help me too to put a lot of my church experience in perspective. So thank you very much. We're going to take a break for about 10 minutes here. And then when we come back, we're going to have our panel. And I'm just aware that you're going to join us for part of that at least, but we may not get an opportunity later on to say our kind of formal thank you to you. So in case you get away on us, please know how grateful we are for your time together with us today. And we hope that you will grace us with your presence again, and so that maybe when we can finally get on the other side of this pandemic and be together in person, you could come again and engage us face to face.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed the opportunities I've had to speak to your community, so thank you very much.
We would welcome that opportunity. Thank you.
Okay.
So it is now, according to my watch, 2:14 Eastern time. Just aware that some of you are in other parts of the country as well, and we're glad that you could join us today too. Let's take a 10-minute break. Now it says 2:15, so let's take it. We'll come back at 2:25 and re-engage with our panel. Look forward to that time together. See you soon.
Hey, it's always a miracle to me how you guys with the technological ability can set this up. It's amazing. Okay, my name is Karen Turner, and I am on the program committee as well as some of these other gentlemen. And I have the honor of facilitating this fascinating panel discussion. I'm quite sure that is what we're going to end up feeling about it. So let me first of all introduce these other people that are on their screen with me. Marlene Knowles, you can wave your hand, Marlene, is a retired Baptist pastor in Atlantic Canada, and she now resides outside of Dartmouth, Nova Scotia on the Eastern Shore. She's very active in various community mission and CABF activities. She is the mother of 2, grandmother of 7, all living within an hour's drive of her home. And then we have Ann Baxter Smith, who has been the pastor at the church at South Point in Surrey, BC for 10 years. She has lived and ministered with her husband in the United States, England, and the Philippines. She particularly enjoys working with young adults and making safe places for their questions. And she has 2 university students of her own. And then Al Roberts. Al was born he's written this for me. Al was born in a Catholic hospital, was delivered by a Jewish doctor, and placed on the cradle roll of a Baptist church. He married a Christian Reformed girl who lovingly helps him stay grounded. His 4 adult children encourage his sincerity, and his 6 grandchildren insist that he keeps his play on. He has served as pastor of 3 CBOQ congregations, currently is in London, Ontario, and has appreciated being connected with the gathering since its inception. So this is our panel. And what are we going to talk about? Our purpose as a panel is not necessarily to discuss or debate the ideas that David Galston has already presented to us, but to use his presentation as a jumping off place for discussion about the pastoral implications of individuals and congregations being exposed to the ever-evolving theological points of view that David has been talking about. Points of view that grow out of emerging scientific and social insights. David has talked about dogmatic addiction, the deep need to cling to traditional dogmas, familiar understandings of God, the Trinity, salvation, the relationship of humans to the natural world, and so on, that become increasingly difficult for some Christians to accept. Some believers, clergy and lay, are drawn to or feel pushed to deconstructing their understanding of the Bible and Christian theology as a result of coming across or even searching out new ideas. And they work over time to resolve the personal anxiety and uncertainty that accompany the search. But others react by being threatened, and out of this anxiety become angry and even more rigid and judgmental about what they perceive as heresy. And therein lies the basis. I admit it's somewhat simplified, but it's the basis for conflict and divisions in many congregations and even denominations. So I am sure there isn't a pastor or church member who is present today who is not familiar with the dynamic that I have just described. But as the members of the panel, you're the ones who get to offer your wisdom today. So we're going to kind of focus on three different questions, and I'm hoping that we can have some time for comment and questions from the group. David, tell me again, it's 2:30. How long do we have?
We have, I think, 45 minutes.
Okay, we're good. We're good.
Yeah. And if people have questions, they can still direct them through Kim, and we'll pass them along to you, Karen.
Yes, right. Thank you for saying that. I would have forgotten. Okay, so I'm going to, as I say, I've got three questions. The panelists, just to be for transparency's sake, I'll let you know that the panelists have seen the question. We'll give each person an opportunity to kind of give their thoughts on each of the questions, and then maybe some dialogue between them if they so desire. So the first one is, can you each describe your personal and or pastoral experience with the theological and spiritual fallout of these varying reactions to having traditional and familiar dogmas challenged by new understandings of the world that have emerged in the last century? So your personal and pastoral experience with this fallout.
Is there a particular order you want us to go in, Karen?
Oh, this time let's go from east to west. So Marlene, you can go first.
Okay. As I thought about that question, I started thinking about the really firm things that I was brought up to believe as a Baptist growing up in a small community with the only Protestant church being the Baptist church. And so therefore we were Baptist through and through. And so therefore we were taught, whether it was from the pulpit or whether it was just understood, a number of things. And I think I shared with the panelists before that when I was very young, I always believed and had been taught that anybody who was not baptized by immersion, born again, could not be saved. And so when I first met, a young Catholic girl who was a very good friend, and I shared with her my anxiety about the fact that she was going to go to hell, and she said she had been very worried for me because I was going to be going to hell, and that was the turning point for me to start questioning some things. And of course, women, I never knew a woman pastor, and women were certainly not to even think about going into the pastorate. And so that was a very big challenge for me. And the fallout from that I saw in my churches, because in the East, in Atlantic Canada, we still have a lot of churches who do not believe women belong in leadership roles, either as deacons or in the pulpit. So for me to even go this route into the ministry was a big deal for me, but over time, and I realized that when God calls, he doesn't make mistakes. Now, I know we've talked a lot about who is God and does God speak and all this stuff. Well, I know he called, and I went along. And what I discovered was that as a pastor, a woman pastor in a world where you really were not welcomed, I as a pastor, I was thankful to be in the pulpit, number one, and so I took it very seriously, and I really spent a lot of time bringing young women into the pulpit to speak, to having to talking about women in the Bible and the role that women can play, and I think. And I know that some of those things really worked because there were people who had not voted for me, who came to my office in tears saying how ashamed they were that they had not voted for me, that their mind and their thinking had changed. So that was one way that as a pastor, I was able to deal with that, that dogma, that belief that I had grown up with, and so many others had grown up with too. There's been a lot of them. There's a lot of those different beliefs that I grew up with. And not only did Catholics go to hell, but homosexuality was definitely a sin. I couldn't even attend another church. It was off limits, and so on and so forth. So it's been a long road of experiences, and I'd say my changes personally have come through education, have come through experiencing, and come through questioning. So I appreciated what David said today about we need to have centers for questionings. Anyway, I'll just leave it at that for now. I want to hear what Alan and Nan have to say.
Okay, Alan, you're carrying the banner for CVOQ, so carry. Your turn.
Well, that's a load. I want to begin with a sort of anecdotal story, but it kind of ties in with what David began with right at the beginning of the morning, or our time together, about being questioned about our, perspective, our doctrine, our beliefs, or whatever. And I remember going. I was sort of fresh, green out of seminary, and meeting with a pulpit search committee at a church, and they inquired, so tell us your views on open and closed membership. Now, for those of you in Baptist churches, there's different ways we, I guess, designate people's level of belonging to the community. And for those from other faith traditions and coming into a Baptist congregation, some Baptist churches require that people are baptized by immersion to become members. And of course, as I mentioned in your introduction of me, that I married a Christian Reformed girl who was baptized as an infant and did profession of faith as a young adult. And of course, when we were meeting with this congregation, they said, well, you understand that we're closed membership. And I acknowledged that, and I explained to them what my perspective on open and closed membership was. And they said, well, you don't have to worry about that because we just voted on it. So it's done. It's like we've determined that we're closed membership. So after that was mentioned, it was interesting, the whole table of people that represented different parts of the congregation sort of erupted, and there was this debate going on. I was being interviewed, but I was suddenly out of the picture. It was like I wasn't there, and I was listening to this sort of a little bit of a battle going on about why this was still an issue. Anyway, at the end of it all, I guess I had to interject and chime in and say, well, it sounds to me like it's still an issue, that even though you voted on it, it's still a bit of a problem. But anyway, the reason I cite this is because it was in that experience that I learned something early on, and maybe I gleaned a lot from being part of the gathering back then, because I recognizing that it was it was a contentious thing in the life of the church family. I thought, as I ended up being called to this congregation, even though my views were different than they voted on. And even that to me was something important for me to affirm in myself, is even though I might not totally agree with everybody's perspective on different theological things, we could certainly, worship together, pray together, break bread together, serve together. But my response to it in the pastoral role was to learn the value of what we were talking about earlier about education. And I thought, why do people hold the views that they do? Why do they see membership this way or that way? And so we basically spent over a year studying the subject of baptism, studying the subject of the Lord's Supper, looking at it biblically and historically in different traditions and so on. So when in the end, when it unfortunately came to another vote a couple of years later, but with the view that if we were going to affirm something, we knew why we were affirming it. Because early on, people were saying, well, the reason people have to be baptized by immersion is because I had to be, or, I was Anglican and they wouldn't let me in until I got, so you're going to have to do that. So anyway, in the end, we thought about it and looked at it theologically, biblically, historically, and then we were able to say and affirm as a congregation, we want to be open membership because that makes sense to us now. So that was for me, was a great learning thing for me. So it's something I was able to hold on to in my ongoing pastoral leadership. So that's my story.
Thank you. And what have you got to say on this one?
Well, like Marlene, I grew up in a church where women didn't teach men, they didn't serve communion. You could cut up the bread, but you could not serve communion. When I decided to go to seminary, I was asked to meet before the group of elders, and they told me that I could become a counselor, but not go into any kind of leadership. I did. So that was probably my break with that particular form of dogmatic addiction. But I had my own, and it showed up by this feeling like I had to somehow figure out my theology. And I took that role very seriously in seminary, and I spent so much time trying to come up with a coherent framework, systematic theology, that it felt at times like my head was going to burst. After a couple of years of this, I had this moment where I was walking up the stairs of this old, beautiful building, and I had had some suffering in my life. My sister was waiting for a double transplant. And I reached this point where the pressure of trying to have all the answers and understand God got so great that I just shrugged it off. And I said, I don't believe anymore. Sorry, God, this is too much hard work. I'm not, that's it. I'm done. And I hadn't had any sense of presence, the ultimate ground of being, whatever we want, God's presence for probably 9 months. When I said that, within 30 seconds, I had this overwhelming sense of presence. And I got angry. I'm like, no way. Don't you dare come close to me now. Like, don't you dare show your face. And I sensed this chuckle. And something happened in that moment. I shifted from a faith that needed answers to this faith that made room for mystery. And it was a real conversion experience for me. So I'm definitely following in the theist category, but with this comfort with questions. I did want to say that's like in my personal story, and I have all sorts of stories I could tell about coming up against, work environments where that wasn't welcome. But I did want to bring it down to a pastoral level because you asked us for both our personal and pastoral experience. So I want to tell about three different people on my leadership team and how I've seen this fallout in their lives. And I'm speaking these stories very intentionally because I would like to offer up that our critical thinking isn't the only piece of our being going on. Like, there is our heart, and there's our spirit, and there's our trauma, and there is our lived reality. And people are in our churches are trying to make sense of all of this. Okay, first person on the leadership team when I was called to our church, devout, beloved follower of Jesus. His wife gets pregnant with their second child. They find out that the baby has a birth defect and won't live. This baby's born. He lives for a few days and dies. This fellow, they moved up north. He couldn't reconcile the loss of his child with his faith. Within 2 years, he'd left his wife, he'd left his faith, and began to live a radically alternative lifestyle. So, one model. Second person, around the same time in our church, also on the leadership team, helped us as a church come to that place of welcoming a gay couple into membership. They have a child. She gets cancer. They believe she's going to be healed by faith through prayer. She's not. Over the course of a couple years, they come to the decision that our church isn't orthodox enough, that we didn't have firm enough dogma. They also left our church. There's a third man in our church, also on the leadership, had cancer as a child. A year ago, he found out that he had cancer in his brain that needed surgery. He's been on a process of deconstruction for some time. He's an avid reader of theology. He's on the leadership team now. He stopped coming to church in September. He couldn't figure out how to make sense of it. But he wants to stay on our team, and he wants to stay in our community because we're his tribe, and he wants to work it through together. So those are 3 examples of how I see people grappling with their worldview, their Christian theological dogma, their belief within the context, not just of ideas coming at them, but also their lived experience. And just to say, this is complicated territory, and it demands a lot of compassion.
Thank you. Thank you. Those were 3 very insightful responses. Okay, the second question is, do you find the term that David has coined, dogmatic addiction, useful as a way of understanding the pain caused by the controversies and divisions that you've described? Why or why not? So is the term useful?
I guess this was difficult for me because I looked up of course, the definition of addiction, and it was very powerful and very serious and very brain damaging and all the rest of it. But then to listen to David today talk about his idea of what it meant, I could understand where he was coming from. And as I looked at all of the things that I believed for so many years growing up, and the people that I know who still believe that dogma very strongly, I can see that there is, it can be overwhelming and it can be controlling, and there needs to be some way of breaking free from it. For me to break free from that addiction took time. It took experiences. It took me meeting lots of people, visiting lots of different denominational churches, visiting, just having all of those beliefs challenged in one way or another. So I feel that I was never addicted, but I do know people who are addicted, and it's frightening. And in our denomination, the convention, I remember when they were removing my credentials, and they removed them because I had done a same-sex wedding, and that was against their policy. So they removed my credentials, which was not a bad thing. It was okay. But I remember them saying to me, the people from the convention office, when they were meeting with me, they were telling me that since a church was very strong in being anti-dogmatic, just could question things, and that church had left the convention on total, and no other church in the entire convention would ever stand up and question things that were going on. Didn't matter what it was. Nobody would question. There was a fear there or something. But these people from convention office sat there and said, we are now afraid of what the future is going to bring, because what is happening is that we are moving from a central position to very, very right wing. The churches in the convention were becoming more and more fundamental and steeped in this dogmatic addiction. And I don't know what has been happening within the convention lately, but I do know that there is a need for people who are not afraid to question. So I don't even know where I'm going with this, except to say that, is it useful? It is now more useful to me as I think about it. And I thought it was too harsh, but now I'm understanding it a little bit better. And so I guess that's about all I'll say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Al, do you find it a useful concept? You're muted, Al.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. When I was thinking about addiction, I was thinking about something that you can't live without, or don't think you can live without. Like it's absolutely essential. And so in that way, I do see that as sort of a helpful way to look at people's hold of things, or maybe the right word is they're being held by something and not wanting to let it go, or let them go. And Marlene, you mentioned the word that came up, I thought was really sort of foundational to this, is the whole idea of fear. Fear is I think is the driving force in so much of our pain and struggle these days in communities. But I also know, and this is one of those axioms, those biblical axioms that I kind of hang a hat on it, perfect love casts out fear. And so if, when we're responding to people's fear of letting go of a certain way of thinking about something, providing the space that's sort of secure, loving, caring, to raise the questions, to have the conversations, to have differing views and so on, is vital to the movement. And we are part of, the faith is a movement. Like we're expected to change, but what I find in these times, it's like the people that I find have the hardest time changing in the church are the people whose lives are changing in every other way. So it's not the most senior people that I find have trouble with changing their minds about things, or even many young people, they don't have trouble because everything's we're all exploring and discovering and moving along. But those in the life of the community that the house has changed, their relationships have changed, the kids have moved out, everything's changed. They say, one thing you don't mess with me is my church or my views or my perspectives. Don't ask me to think about changing that. And so there's a lot of fear there. And so if we can somehow respond to the fear, care for the fear, listen to the fear, that's vital, I think. So that's so I find it helpful, and in the end, to think about it that way.
Thank you. Anne, how about you?
I think like on a practitioner level, I think it has real merit and value as we come alongside people and try to observe what's happening. I'm a spiritual director, and I've done some reading on religious addictions, and it's observable that some people who have, like, say you're, an alcoholic and you give up drinking, you can be, a dry drunk and then transfer that addiction onto something else. That something else could be religion. And so you could approach your religion in a really addictive way. But what I was sitting with and pondering is how to build bridges with people who are actively in that place. And I don't know how, if the language is like, has a lot of efficacy to build bridges. And it made me think of this story of this guy who came to our church for a while, and he sat in our church for a year just observing. He felt like he'd been sent by God just to listen and observe. And then after a year, he came up to me once after church and he said, "Anne, I've determined that you are like a stool with two legs. You are missing the third leg, the leg of judgment." And then he told me that the judgment of God was coming, an earthquake was going to come and wipe out Vancouver. And he had his survival skills already. And anyway, I know his intentions were well-meaning, to warn me of the danger of my theology, but him telling me I was a stool with two legs didn't necessarily open me to his perspective. And so I'm sure if I turned to him and said, "You have a dogma addiction to a God of wrath and judgment," he probably wouldn't listen to me either. So, like, how do we come alongside and talk to each other? Because if we just label and other the other, we're actually not going to change anything. So it's like a yes, I agree, something about the label that could also hinder us in moving forward.
That's a really interesting perspective, that it's a useful concept maybe in the mind of the pastor or the church leadership, but yes, going around and accusing people of being addicted probably nobody asked David that one. But yeah, that's a really helpful caution for sure. In Baptist denominational experience, not just Baptist, but other denominations too, the controversies and divisions from this clash of worldviews often resulted in painful and costly splits, church splits. My question is, do you see another way? And if so, what could it look like? What might help a congregation or a denomination to move from being a community of dogma to becoming a community of trust and exploration? Or adding David's term that I really like, becoming a community of dogmatic addiction recovery. So the question is, what in your experience, what can a church community look like that is trying to be able to provide the support to people who are in real pain as their beliefs are being challenged? Marlene.
Well, I think that Al said it very clearly when he said the value of visiting the congregants, the parishioners, and knowing their pain, knowing where they're coming from and what they believe and what they don't believe, and just being able to sit with them and walk with them through, because it's a journey for them. no matter what it is that they believe or don't believe, that in order for them to deal with that, it's a journey, and our job would be to come alongside them on that journey. I remember one girl, in fact, I had two girls in my congregation who had been very severely mistreated and abused by their fathers. And it had never occurred to me until she mentioned how she hated the Lord's Prayer because it said "Our Father," and how she could not see God as a father at all. It was very it was just very hurtful to her and to this other girl as well. And so I know that for me to take the time to come alongside her, and from that point on to be very careful about how we spoke about God in our services, and that we changed the word Father to a number of other names, and it seemed to help her a lot, and to know that he was a loving presence in her life, as opposed to a symbol of an abusive father. So as a congregation, I think that's one way of doing it, is just, and I think that I was thinking about the book that Tony Campolo wrote years and years ago. Was kind of I can't remember the title. It was Hot Potatoes. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. Anyway, I just think things like that in your congregation as an opportunity to discuss and to read, to think, to talk, having dialogues, having all kinds of wonderful opportunities for people. Karen, your wife, Heather, told me once, people need stories. They need stories. And I think that's just a very important part of what a congregation could do.
Thank you. I just a question that occurred to me listening to you. Well, you gave a very specific example of a change that you made in the language because of the painful experience of two very important members of the community. Sometimes there is pushback, though, is there not, from other people in the church who would say something like, well, of course God is Father. Jesus called God Father, so therefore, what's the matter with it? Who are not able to be that empathetic, make that empathetic change in their own minds. And so that's an example. I'm making that example up. Maybe nobody did, but that there's people in the congregation who resist the change because they are so entrenched in the way that they've always believed.
One of the things I can say, Karen, is that as a minister, a woman in ministry, there was no role expectation. So I could get away with a great deal. And I did. And it was very subtle. I did not go into the pulpit and say, okay, from now on, we will not be calling God Father. We just did it very casually and simply, and, but you're right.
Very wise. Very wise.
Well,
Al, what?
Yeah, I was going to say earlier, I kind of hinted at the fact that issue that I grappled with initially with this congregation apparently had been solved by a vote, but then later on it still required a vote. And I think part of in our communities, this feeling that we have to all come to some agreement where the majority wins, or there's winners. Somebody's got to win. Because heaven forbid we have two opinions here. And that's one of the wonderful things that we always are. When we are self-described Baptists, talk about our having many opinions, right? So it's one of the things I value about being Baptist, is that historically we've been communities of people that we have different ideas on different things, and it's okay. And I think so. Another issue came up in the church. Well, and this ties in, I guess, with the denominational thing too. Is in order to move together from where we are to where this place that we understand to be the divine modus operandi or whatever, that in order to move together, there's always going to be creative tension. And I think one of the things we can practice in communities is patience, which is loving, and perfect love casts out fear. So if we practice patience and say, when I hike with groups of people, there's always people at the front of the group that are ready to just sort of go over the hill and run ahead past the white swatches on the trail. And there's always that group of people sitting on the stump with their granola bar saying, we're not moving yet, we're not going, you can't make us go. And so there's always this fear that, we're going to break apart. You've got these two different opinions. So in a life of communities, how do you move with people like an elastic band so it has some tension, good tension, creative tension, but you don't go so fast that and so far that it snaps. So I think having a sort of a sense of listening, I think the thing that helps us from snapping is ensuring that everybody is listened to. That even though we might disagree on the subject matter, whatever it is that we're grappling with, calling God Father or not Father, whatever, giving the person an opportunity to say, this is why this is important to me. When I use this word or that, this is why, and for them to be heard and listened to and paid attention to says that they're part of the movement and they're not being left out. And I think that's part of why we experience so much pain in our communities, is because people don't feel they're part of it. So of course they're gonna go away, walk away or whatever. That's my thought.
That's very true, very wise. Anne, what's your thoughts on this?
So the words that stuck out to me in the question was how to move from being a community of dogma to a community of trust and exploration. So trust and exploration. I'm like, how do we foster that? And in one sense, at least where I'm at now, I had an easy job because I came in to a church that had made a really, I don't know if it was conscious or unconscious, but they set me up well, because instead of having a doctrinal statement, they just had 4 core images: the image of the well, the table, the seat, and the net. And having our church defined by these images, these values, has really helped us a lot, because it gives us freedom to have a unity that's more than a uniformity of ideas. So the well means we're drawn together by our common thirst. And I like that. We're not drawn together by our common ideas. We're drawn together by our common thirst for life, for God, for Jesus. The table is that place of unconditional welcome. We all get a seat at the table. And we stay at the table when we disagree, and we keep talking it out like a family does. A seed normalizes growth. And of course, when you grow, you change. Our ideas about God are always evolving. And the expectation that they should be static, it just doesn't match reality. I often think of the image of the little crabs, they start out really small, and then to grow, they have to shed their skin. And then there's this period of time where they're vulnerable for about 24 hours before their new shell hardens. And I think our images of God are like that. We shed ideas, and then we grow into a newer container for our ideas about God, and then we shed them. So there's change, there's growth, it's a seed, it's shifting. And then the final one is the net. And then the net is about restoring relationships. If God created an interconnected world, and we're about the restoration of all those relationships. So our mission isn't conversion oriented, it's reconciliation oriented. So that's really helped us. some practices that help us. One practice that helps us in the exploration piece is just normalizing having questions that we don't know the answers to. That's not a scary thing. That can be just like that's just reality, right? And I love the quote by Rilke. I'm just going to read this quote. Maybe you guys all know it, but whenever I get nervous about my questions, I read this. I read it to students, or I read it to my two young adults. It's, be patient towards all that is unsolved in your heart and try to love the questions themselves. Like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue, do not now seek the answers which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. And then this is the part I like, live the questions now. Perhaps you will gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So it takes the pressure off of it, you know? So that's the exploration piece. The trust piece, I would just like to throw out a tool that has been so transformative in my own life as a mother, as a pastor, and it's the tool of learning how to validate well. I did this parenting course. I have one of my children has really big emotions and so easy to want to push them down, and I learned to just make space for them and validate it. I don't have to agree. It's not about agreement, but it's about saying, I can really understand why you would see that. So, you know, somebody who's freaked out because of my view of scripture is different. I can be like, of course that scares you. You love scripture. It's a foundation for your life. And I have an opinion that's different than yours. That makes so much sense to me that this would be threatening to you. You know, so that kind of thing diffuses. And I've learned to do that a lot in pastoral situations, which it's what you were saying, you know, Al, it just makes people feel heard. And when people feel heard, it's easier to work through conflict and keep that climate of trust and exploration. So those are some things that I thought of that have helped me grow in this area.
Okay, wow. So there's no, has anybody got, if anybody has any, we have a few minutes, we have 6 minutes. So if you have any questions that you'd like to put to the panel, please send them to Kim in the chat. But while we're seeing if anybody does have a question, I have something further that I'd like to hear from you. This issue of each of you is describing an approach to pastoral ministry that is kind of deeply born out of experience and wisdom. And my question is, I don't think that level of wisdom is taught in seminary. Would that be fair to say? If you were designing a pastoral care course in seminary, what would you include that in your experience has not been included, so that people who are going into ministry can come out with the beginnings anyway of this wisdom of listening to people's stories and not rushing to judgment and to validate their experience, even if it's different from yours. Like, how would you teach that to young pastors? I'm not going to go in order, just if you have any insights to add.
I just want to say I was really grateful for the professors I had at seminary. I had a good seminary experience. So, you know, I appreciated the diversity of professors. And I think, but I probably learned more about maybe sort of the wise things about pastoral ministry from loving people in my church communities, families. Like I remember my own stories of having questions of doubt and wondering if I'm on the right track. I remember going to, you know, my pastor saying, I need you to talk to me about Revelation, because, you know, this is important. We have to know when this is all going to end. And, you know, and I was really hung up on this apocalyptic, you know, figuring things out. And in his wisdom, he said, well, maybe we shouldn't think about the end so much as about what God's saying to us today. Like, are you paying attention to what's coming each day? And that I hung on to. So I was learning stuff from people. I had questions about my faith. I went to the senior man, the old man in the church, who asked me every day, how my hockey team made out on Saturday, right? Because we had a relationship, and there's a trust, right? There were people that weren't my parents. They weren't my parents. They weren't, I could, and they were trustworthy enough that I could risk enough to doubt, question, and all that. So, again, I guess it's we're back to the making space and room for storytelling, because that's where we learn a lot, I guess, and are equipped. We get equipped.
I know for me, most of my change and opportunities for talking at seminary or questioning at seminary came through my clinical pastoral education. I took a full course before I ever started my studies. And so I was already on that frame of mind of questioning. So that was a big help. And so I guess that's how I see it working out in the seminary field. Yeah.
I went to seminary about 30 years ago, and in my seminary, there weren't any spiritual formation courses at the time. When I had that event going down the stairs, I became very curious about spiritual formation, and kindly they let me design my own little courses so I could learn about it. I'm so grateful now that most seminaries do have courses on spiritual formation. I would highly recommend people take those. I loved CPE. What a transformative experience. Highly recommend that. But there's some little micro skills I think are really helpful to pastoring. Like, learn about nonviolent communication. It's a thing. You can study it. It's great. Learn about, you can take little courses on the art of validation. Super helpful. I do think that we need to, here's something, there's so much coming out now about trauma and how trauma gets lodged in our bodies, and it controls our emotions. It shapes our emotions, and our emotions shape our cognitive constructs. And so I was brought up in a modernist view that change comes by changing your mind. Now I'm learning that change comes by the opposite way around, right? And so we need to know that as pastors, because talking at people is the least effective way of producing change. So there's a lot we can keep learning that I didn't learn 30 years ago.
Well, I really want to thank you also very much. We're out of time, and I just think this has been a valuable discussion, and I really appreciate the wisdom that we have tapped into with the three of you here today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I say one thing, Karen?
Sure.
Some time ago, I was a person on a panel, and it was about LGBTQ and church life. And somebody reached out to me and wanted me to get in dialogue with them, and I lost that email. So if that person is here, I am so sorry. I've thought about you for such a long time, and I'd love it if you contact me so we could have that conversation. Okay, that's it.
Thank you.
And you can reach out to Anne through the chat function if you want to. That's a good way to find her right now.
That would be true.
Karen, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you, panelists, for a great conversation. We appreciate this so much. I'm going to bring Larry Ogden into the mix here and turn things over to him. Oh, Larry, you're going to have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
How's that?
That's it.
Okay. Well, it's been a very interesting day. And as David, I don't know if David is still with us or not, but David certainly helped us to understand the importance of the background of how we arrived at our traditional understandings of God, whether that be through our roots in the biblical tradition or Greek philosophy or other sources. And he certainly gave us an excellent overview of how rich and important those sources are. Our 3D or geocentric worldview that prevailed when much of our theology about God was developed, as we know, has long been superseded by the scientific worldview of today. And of course, the scientific worldview now has very huge implications for how the modern church is to understand the concept of God, not to mention its implications for Christology and for the Christian church's practice. By telling us about covenant and enlightenment theology, he showed us that they can still be socially and personally relevant today as they have been throughout the whole history of Christianity. So thank you very much, David, if you're still with us, for your very engaging presentation. It's challenged each of us to think seriously about how we are to understand the concept of God in today's world and how we are to reflect on that going forward. To our panelists, Anne and Marlene and Al, thank you very much for telling us about how each of you as pastors currently or in the past have dealt with the challenges of explaining to your congregation some of these new understandings of our traditional church theology, whether it be about God or other practices. And hopefully they will lead to spiritual growth and spiritual maturity, as that will help us to avoid misunderstandings and division. It's not necessarily an easy task, but each of you seem to be up to the task that was put before you. I always remember an old saying that my adult education professor gave to me was, you have to start where people are at and then lead them forward. So thank you very much for sharing with us and sharing your thoughts with us. Have a good day. Back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Larry. That concludes the presentation portion of our day. And as I mentioned earlier, we have just a little bit of important business to transact, and we really do encourage everyone to stick around if you would, please. May I also just add a quick commercial on behalf of our program committee that if you have thoughts and ideas about topics for a future discussion, please reach out to me or to other members of our committee. We would love to hear from you. We're always thinking forward, and so we hope to have something out to you soon about the fall. Fred Demaray is our past moderator, and in light of the fact that our current moderator, Blake, was not able to be here today, I'm going to invite Fred to come at this time and to lead our business session together. Thanks, Fred.
And I'll unmute myself. And it's good to see all of you and to have this time together. And thank you very much to the committee for organizing it. The items on the agenda, the first thing includes a paper that has been circulated to those of you who are members of the gathering, at least, by Gary Caldwell, A Gathering as a National Home for the Homeless. And I'm wondering if Gary can speak to that a little bit, since he was the author of it.
Thank you, Fred. Yes, yeah, we distributed that about a month ago to all of you who are on our mailing list, whether you consider yourself a member or not. A Home for the Homeless. I'm not going to read it, but do note that we become an organization. The Gathering of Baptists has become an organization much more like a denomination than ever was our intent. And the reason that we did that is because we have felt it necessary to allow our clergy to minister with the official designations that are appropriate for ministry, but also to allow them to minister with full integrity, their own full integrity. And that's why we offer credentialing. That's why we offer ourselves as an agent for the issuance of licenses to marry. We are federally incorporated, which makes that makes us feel more comfortable to serve as an agent to issue licenses to marry to clergy in any of the provinces or territories in Canada. We recognize that we and CABF, and we're going to hear from CABF in a minute, have similar purposes. And we met in Ottawa well, it seemed like a year or two ago, but it's probably 5, trying to see how we might work together. And I think as we progress, we're finding that there's a greater need for us to work together. If you have any questions about our Home for the Homeless, my name's on the website, my contact information, and I or any of us are always happy to help you to wrestle with the issues of finding a home as best we can. Thank you, Fred. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's any action we have to take on that at the moment, just to be told about it. Marlene, we invite you now to bring some greetings from CABF, our sister, I guess our sister organization that we're maybe needing to figure out a way to work more closely together with as time goes on. So Marlene, over to you.
Wow. Oh, I certainly do bring greetings. I bring greetings from CABF. We had a very difficult past couple of weeks. One of our members passed away very suddenly, and he was one of the founding members of CABF, and we are coming up to our anniversary celebration for 50 years celebration, although it will be 51 in June. And he had written a hymn for it, and he was very eager to be a part of this celebration. So we put him to rest, and it has broken all our hearts to do so. So that has been where we are at right now with CABF, but we are very excited about what's happening in the future and what's hopefully to happen in the future, just as we grow and provide, like the gathering, providing opportunities for people to live out their theology in a safe and encouraging way or place. I appreciate the gathering, and I appreciate CABF, and maybe down the road, I'm sure, I don't see why we can't be working together, because it just would be sensible. So on behalf of CABF, thank you for inviting me, and I wish you all of God's many blessings as you go forward in your ministries. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. And for those of you who are wondering, Marlene's reference to the leader who had recently died was to Roger Prentice, who was well known to many of us as well. So some of us have been feeling that that loss as well, and appreciated the opportunity that the funeral service was available on YouTube after the fact, because I wasn't able to actually participate by being there virtually for the actual service. So I was glad to be able to see what had happened and hear what had happened, and be part of it that way. So thank you.
And
Gary,
Roger,
do you want
also
to speak to the
spoke to
notice
us.
of motion, read the act for the gathering remarriage?
Yeah, I note that Roger Prentice was speaker for the gathering and visited us a couple of times over the years. We do miss him. The notice of motion, which I'll read in a second, is necessary when we, and a little bit of background, when we applied to the Ontario government for our privilege of issuing licenses to marry, or licenses to clergy to perform marriages. I had to run around and get the signatures of a whole horde of members, because we did not have authority for the board of directors to act on behalf of the membership. So this motion, as we anticipate proceeding across the country as necessary, to gain that privilege of being an agent to issue licenses to clergy to perform marriages. This motion has the intent of giving authority to the board. So I only need to collect 7 or 8 signatures, or 9 or 10, whatever our number are, rather than all of the members on our membership list. I offer notice of motion to be presented at our October gathering, that the Board of Directors of the Gathering of Baptists be empowered to act on behalf of the membership in preparing, authorizing, and presenting applications to any or all of the provinces and territories for the Gathering of Baptists to serve as an agent to apply for license to perform marriages on behalf of clergy whose ordination is recognized under the Gathering umbrella and who is practicing ministry in that province or territory of Canada. That notice of motion will go out with the minutes, and we will present it for approval or thumbs down in October. Thank you, Fred.
And again, there's no action we have to take now. It's just a matter of information. So is there any other business from any of the other board members or anybody, a member of the gathering, that you want to raise? Not hearing any. I guess I can just simply turn it back to Gary for any announcements that need to be made.
Well, the most important announcement is that our fall gathering is scheduled for October 29th. And we're deliberating over the topic. And as Dave has already said, stole my lines, we need your input. Tell us what you would like to talk about, what you would like us to present for you to ponder over. The other announcement that I have is that we have held off putting out our membership campaign letter because people do tend to confuse membership and registration sometimes. So we're breaking them apart. But now that Kim has finished registering us for this gathering, I'm going to put out a request for your membership, payment of your membership dues in the next few weeks. And if you want to know why we need membership dues, it's all on the website, so I won't repeat it. I did, however, probably about a month ago, send out to all of you who have already paid your 2022 memberships a notice, so you don't have to pay them twice, or you don't forget and pay them twice. But if you do, I'll credit you for 2023. That's it. Thank you very much.
And if I can just add to that announcement just a little bit to say, if any of you here today are eager to be on the board, because we would like to grow the board more, a little bit more, and particularly people from outside of the Central Ontario or Southern Ontario focus, so that we can say our membership is represented more broadly, then I would be glad to hear from you. And you can find my email address through the website, I think, too. So, but I'd be glad to hear from you, because part of my role as the past moderator, I'm twice past. I was past moderator, then I was moderator again. Now I'm past moderator again. But part of my role is to chair the nominating committee. So I would be glad to hear from any of you who are interested in serving. And I may be approaching some of you today. I've been taking note of people who were here and who might be a possibility. So it's now for me to dismiss us with a benediction. So may the blessing of God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer be with you all as you go on your way. And may what we do be pleasing to God, however we understand God, that it may be helping us to move into a very strong future of strength and work together. Amen.
Thank you, Fred. I'm going to leave the link open for a few minutes here in case people want to visit with one another a little bit. You'll have to unmute yourselves to do that, but please take advantage of the opportunity. And we look forward to seeing you all in October.
Do we not need a financial statement or anything like that?
Not now. Not this
Okay.
time. That's the October meeting.
Oh, that's the October. Okay, thank you.
And can I add to the invitation for people who might be interested in joining the board? I would also issue an invitation for those who might feel called to come on the program committee and help plan these events. We are always looking for new ideas, new insights. So I think I can probably say safely that you could contact Dave Ogilvy if you really feel that.
Or Karen Turner.
Well, you could contact me too. Dave's the boss. Dave's the chair.
Can I say that it was a real privilege to be here today? Thank you for the invitation. It's been fun.
Thanks so much for joining us, Marlene.
Yes,
Take
good to
care.
have you with us, Marlene.
Thanks.
Thank you,
It's
Marlene.
been nice
Thank
to
you.
have Marlene and Anne from one side of the country to the other
Yeah.
to get to know you a little bit, to hear your ideas, your experiences, because some of us have been around together for quite some years, and yeah, it's fresh faces are great. Hello,
Kind
Heather.
of fun to have that breadth across the country, isn't it?
Mhm. I think we have to work
Okay.
on that.
Good night, everybody, or goodbye. So,
It's good night
it
to you.
feels like
yes.
night. I know it isn't. Thank you again. Bye.
Bye.
Do take good care, and
You too.
we'll hope to see you all again soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
Bye.
Bye all.
Bye.
Thank you, Gary.
Bye-bye.